at the beginning of the actor Will Smith's memoir, which came out a few years ago. He tells a story about how when he was 11 years old, his dad decided he needed a new brick wall in his shop. Now, this was a big wall, roughly 12 feet high by 20 feet long. And the old wall was crumbling, and his dad, according to the memoir, was sick of looking at it. But instead of hiring a contractor or a construction company, Will Smith's dad figured this was a great job for Will and his brother to undertake. So what followed was nearly a year of him and his brother going to his father's shop whenever they had free time after school to work on building this wall. And they did everything themselves, taking the old wall down, digging the footings, mixing the mortar, carrying the buckets, laying brick after brick. Everything that was done, they did after school, during weekends and holidays. It didn't matter. Under the watchful eye of their dad, they did the work of building this wall. Predictably, this got pretty old for two boys who would much rather be out playing with friends than building a wall in their father's shop. One day in particular, their dad overheard them complaining, asking one another, "Why do we have to build this wall for anyway?" Well, their dad was not too happy to hear that. Angrily, in the midst of the lecture, he told them, "Stop worrying, stop thinking about the wall. There is no wall. There are only bricks. Your job is to lay this brick perfectly, then move on to the next brick and lay that brick perfectly, then the next one. Don't be worrying about the wall. Your only concern is one brick." Also predictably, in that moment, Will thought his dad was crazy. But as the year went on, Smith admits that he began to understand what his dad was attempting to communicate that day. When he focused on the wall, the task felt big, overwhelming, and impossible to complete. But he knew how to lay one brick. And as he focused on doing that one thing he knew how to do, the task felt easier. And before too long, he began to see not just a mound of bricks, but a wall taking shape. What felt impossible at the beginning, he and his brother eventually completed. As we've gone through our series, Food for Thought, we've seen how time and again, God has shown up when God's people seem to be facing an impossible situation. And God shows up to feed both their physical hunger and the spiritual hunger they felt. We've talked about manna in the wilderness every day for 40 years as the Israelite people journeyed with God. We've seen how an angel fed Elijah in the desert when Elijah was in the deepest moment of darkness and he wished that it would all just end. We saw how Jesus declares himself to be the true manna, which came down from heaven to give life to the world. We've seen how God invites all to come to God's table of grace. And last week we took a turn and talked about how we most fully find Jesus amongst those who hunger and thirst for justice in the world. And not only will Christ be present amongst those people, but Christ promises to satisfy their hunger for justice. Now, I don't know about you, but so often when I look out into the world, this task of pursuing justice, of seeing God's kingdom come on earth just as it is in heaven, can sometimes feel like an impossible task. We long for peace in this world, and yet our world is riddled with violence and war, mistreatment and hatred. We long for people to feel safe. And yet every time a new breaking news story comes around, we are reminded that safety is not a given in our world. It's something we have to work on and work towards. We long for people to have enough for their basic needs to be met. And yet we know there are millions of people who struggle to find affordable housing and even more lack access to safe drinking water. And specifically this month, with the Rise Against Hunger event this Saturday and the Crop Hunger Walk later this month, we are focusing in on the many people who find themselves struggling with food insecurity and hunger. Here's just a few numbers. Globally, 733 million people face hunger. A total of 2.33 billion, about 29% of the global population, face food insecurity of some sort. That's over 1 in every 4 people struggling with food insecurity in our world. And it's not just something that happens in other nations. While it's certainly less likely in America, there are 47 million Americans, including 1 in every 5 children, who are food insecure. That's 13.7% of the American population. And even worse, of those 47 million people, it is estimated that 36% of them make too much to qualify for government assistance programs to help provide food. Unless we think that's just an issue in other parts of the country. The organization Feeding America estimates that over 3,000 people in Waynesboro, Virginia, are food insecure. 14.7% of our local population. This is not just an issue for those who are across the globe or in some other part of our country. They are our neighbors. These are people who live down the street or across town. Their children or grandchildren go to school with our children and grandchildren. We see them in the grocery store or visiting the blessings box right out here outside of our sanctuary. And I don't know about you, but when I hear numbers like that, it is easy to get overwhelmed and become paralyzed, wondering if the little bit that I have to offer can make a difference. What is my little offering in the face of such a big problem? And that is what the disciples are facing in our text this morning in John chapter 6. Jesus and his disciples are along the Sea of Galilee, being followed constantly by this big crowd of people who are excited because they've seen Jesus heal the sick. They are wondering and excited about what God is up to in Jesus, wondering about who he is and wanting to see something amazing. And Jesus looks up and sees this huge crowd, some 5,000 people drawing near, and he looks over to his disciple Philip and asks, "Where are we going to buy bread for all of these people?" Now, I don't know about you, but there are moments in the New Testament where I feel really bad for the disciples. I mean, Philip is here, and we are told in the text that Jesus asked this question to test him. Where are we going to buy this bread? And Philip is like, whoa, I did not sign up to feed 5,000 people today. I make dinner for 10 people and can feel overwhelmed. I can't imagine what it would be like trying to buy enough bread for 5,000 people. I mean, can you imagine the bread shortage after that purchase? And Philip says it would cost over 200 denarii just to feed them a little bit. That's about 7 months' wages for an average worker, unskilled worker in that day. Andrew, one other disciple, comes forward and says, well, here's a boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But what's this among so many people? When I look at the issue of hunger in our world today, so often I find myself asking that same question. Well, I've got $30 of canned goods, but what are they among such a big need? And the disciples are facing this huge crowd of hungry people. They see what little they have to offer, and they're like, this won't make a dent. But when I read this story, I am most fascinated not by the disciples, but this boy. We know absolutely nothing about this boy. Was he from a wealthy family? Did he skip school to join the crowd of people that were following Jesus around? Speaking of family, where was his family? They're never mentioned in the text. Was he someone who had run away? Did he experience abuse or mistreatment? Did he rely on the generosity of the community around him to fill his needs? Ultimately, we don't know. But what we are told in the story is that he had this meal. and he overheard the discussion between the disciples and Jesus, and he offers up his lunch to help. Now, maybe this boy was offering it out of a sincere, naive kindness that children often exhibit. I wonder if he knew that this was not nearly enough to solve the problem the disciples were facing. Or was he thinking, I've seen Jesus do big things before. And maybe, just maybe, with this small sacrifice, Jesus can do something big again. What is most fascinating to me about this boy is that he saw the same need the disciples saw. There was a huge crowd of hungry people. And while the disciples saw the need and were paralyzed by how massive the task was, how in the world could we feed all these people? Not this boy. This boy saw the problem, heard the discussion, and made a small sacrifice, a small offering. And with that small sacrifice, I just get in my mind that Jesus stretches out his fingers, cracks his neck a little bit and says, watch this. He tells the disciples to have the crowd sit down, gives thanks over the food, and just begins passing it out. One person to the next. First the bread, then the fish, and from this small lunch, 5,000 people were not only fed, but there was 12 baskets full of bread left over afterwards. Because in the hands of Jesus, even a small lunch can feed a multitude. In the hands of Christ, even a small sacrifice can be multiplied to feed hungry people. In the hands of Jesus, a small action motivated by faith can be used to bend the world ever so slightly in the direction of God's kingdom and God's justice, where people's needs are met, and we get just a tinier, further glimpse of God's kingdom at work in the world. Jesus took a small offering of a boy and provided abundantly more than anyone thought could ever have been done with it. Because in the hands of Jesus, one small step of faith has the possibility of making a mark on the world. When I think about the work that we will undertake this Saturday, when we will join with other congregations around Waynesboro and other members of our community with the goal of packing 30,000 meals. And while that is no small number, in the face of the many millions who face hunger in our world today, it can feel like a small sacrifice, a tiny dent in the problem. But don't ever discount what God can do through small sacrifices. While I don't necessarily think that 30,000 meals will miraculously be multiplied into millions, I do believe that each belly filled is worthy of our time and effort. And as we have seen time and again throughout this series, when God shows up to meet the physical hunger of people, they also have a tendency of coming face to face with the one who alone can satisfy the deepest desires of the human heart. I wonder, when you look out at the many problems of the world, what do you find yourself passionate about fixing? What are those issues that make holy anger rise up in you, that you find yourself returning to praying for and longing for a day when that issue is solved for good? I wonder if maybe this text is calling us to take a step of faith like the boy did in our story. He made that small sacrifice, offered up his lunch to the work of Christ, and 5,000 people were fed. What is the one small step of faith you can take to begin solving that issue in the world you find your soul screaming about? Maybe it's just a season of researching the problem so that you can have a full understanding of it. Maybe it's dedicating time to pray. Maybe it's looking for organizations here in Waynesboro or Augusta County that do the work that you are passionate about, and spending and sacrificing some time of your week, of your month, of your year to that work. Not long ago, one of you, a congregation member, came into my office and talked about the Blue Ridge Area Food Bank, which provides meals for people in need in our area. Getting involved in this solving hunger isn't something that we can relegate necessarily to one moment or one day out of the year. But if that is what you are passionate about, if that is what God is stirring up in you, find a way. Take a step. Maybe look up Blue Ridge Area Food Bank. Or maybe the step that God wants you to take is just taking a turn, as many of you already do, to help fill our blessings box outside of the church, so that when people have need, they can come and take. We like to think that the world gets changed through big acts of people in power. But I think the truth of the matter is that the world is changed day after day by the many small acts of faith and hope and love by everyday people like you and me. And these actions might feel small, especially in the face of what seems to be impossibly large problems. But in the hands of God, who knows what might happen through a small sacrifice of faith. And maybe one day we will be able to tell a story like John does here in John chapter 6, about how a small act of faith became a banquet for the multitudes in the hands of Christ. After all, as Will Smith's dad might tell us, don't worry about the wall. Lay a brick. What is that brick that you can lay to help build God's justice in our world today? I hope that you would lay it down, that you would make that sacrifice, that you would take that small step of faith and be ready, because Jesus might just say, watch this.